Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, the fight for the open skies. Can the United States actually shut Middle Eastern Airlines out of the US? There are claims of unfair subsidies, billions in government money which plays against the American carriers. Is it anti-competitive or just competitive? Also this week, One Belt, One Road. China rolls out its multi-billion-dollar Silk Route. And the first destination is Pakistan. But who does it really benefit? Islamabad's power-hungry economy or Beijing's strategic interests? And the cost of corruption. Brazil's oil giant finally puts a price on it. We'll tell you why the so-called car wash scandal at Petrobras has been a drag on the whole Brazilian economy. Well, aviation connects the world, we know that, but this week we're actually looking at a major division, a battle for air supremacy between the legacy carriers of the United States and the Gulf Airlines. Delta, United and American, the three biggest US airlines, say they have evidence that their rivals, Emirates, Qatar and Etihad, are receiving unfair government subsidies, something that goes against aviation's open skies policy. Now, if you've not heard of open skies, it's basically a policy concept aimed at making international commercial aviation fair. It wants a free market environment with minimal government influence or intervention. The most significant agreement actually signed was in 2007 between the US and the European Union. So with that corner of the sky looked after, the US airlines have now turned their attention to the Middle East. They hired forensic accountants to support their claims, and this is what they came up with. That since 2004, the Gulf carriers have received subsidies worth $42 billion. More specifically, Etihad. Well, it made losses of $4 billion back in 2013, but has received more than $17 billion in subsidies from Abu Dhabi over the last decade. Qatar Airways has apparently gotten $16 billion in subsidies from its government since 2004. And Dubai gave Emirates $5 billion, some of which went to cover losses from trading fuel contracts, also known as hedging. Now, not surprisingly, the Gulf carriers refute all of this. They say it's a US problem, their own poor service and old planes. But the claims are being investigated, which could lead to the Gulf carriers being shut out of US skies.
With their young fleets, the latest in-flight services and massive transit hubs, the big three Gulf carriers consistently rank among the top airlines in the world. They also all fly into a number of major US cities, leading to increased competition and increased concern from the home carriers.
We have great service. We take good care of our passengers. The real issue is that the Gulf carriers are receiving more than $40 billion in subsidies from their governments. And that's not something a private company should have to compete against. They are cutting into the U.S. carriers' ability to compete on international routes because they're being undercut. So what that means is the U.S. carriers are going to wind up losing those international routes. And every time we lose an international route, we're losing 800 American jobs.
So that's the argument, a playing field, or perhaps a runway in this case, which is uneven. And the US government's taking the threat seriously. It could potentially freeze flights at their current levels from the Gulf, whilst any anti-competitive behaviour is investigated. But is plain old regular competition between airlines also a factor to consider?
The struggle with the U.S. airlines is mainly because of that fierce competition out there. There's a lot of pressure to keep these fares down because there's so much competition in the marketplace. If there was less competition, these fares could be higher, and then ideally that would be reinvested into the employees and to new equipment and that sort of thing that would, elevate these scores.
And when you don't reinvest, the knock-on effect across the airlines and their services can become apparent.
The airlines are not performing well in each of these categories that are important to the traveling public. They're not getting us there on time with our bags and without complaint. So because of that, the overall industry score is going down.
So in some ways there's a perfect storm. Young new players up against the legacy carriers. Lobbyists on both sides, because remember, US companies like Boeing get a lot of business from the Gulf, and an investigation which could change the way so many of us fly to the United States.
Now, this whole issue of government funding is something we've been asking the Gulf carriers about for some time. Have a look at this. It's from our Dubai Air Show broadcast back in November of 2013. The first question I asked the president of Emirates Airlines, Tim Clark, was about the subsidies.
For us, the second part of the question is, yes, the governments understand the criticality of aviation in their national business model. So it sits a lot higher in their priorities than it may do in the US or in Europe. And that's a great thing. As far as Emirates is concerned, that's as far as it goes. We have enormous support from the government. They go out of their way to do all sorts of things, but they don't provide us any money. So you ask about financing these aircraft, and we've been asked that question for the last 25 years. And each time we order large numbers, they say, where are you going to fly them, and how are you going to pay for them, and is the government subsidizing you, etc. We know where we're going to fly them. We know that the government will give us no subsidies or no money. We have recourse to a multitude of debt instruments, which includes our own cash resources, because we are fortunately been able to build up a large amount of cash on our balance sheet. So we don't contemplate having any kind of difficulties.
And then more recently, it turned a little nasty, because when the Gulf carriers accused the US airlines themselves of receiving $15 billion in subsidies after 2002, well, this was the response from the CEO of Delta Airlines, Richard Anderson.
That is categorically false. And it's a great irony to have the United Arab Emirates from the Arabian Peninsula talk about that, given the fact that our industry was really shocked by the terrorism of 9/11, which came from terrorists from the Arabian Peninsula, that caused us to go through a massive restructuring. And in the United States, our restructuring process is transparent, and there is no government subsidy.
So it's not pretty, is it? A real battle for the skies, because there's so much business and money at stake. Well, we're going to step slightly outside the bubble to discuss the issue. Joining us from Muscat, actually, is Paul Gregorowitsch, who is the CEO of Oman Air, that country's national carrier. Paul, thanks for joining us. I want to get your opinion as a Gulf player. Admittedly, not one of the big three, but still a Gulf player. What do you think of this argument? Do the US carriers have a point?
I don't think that the US carriers have a point here. Airlines are always working in a highly competitive environment, and I'm a little bit surprised that the American carriers are now taking such a protective stance. In the past, those American carriers were protected by the government under Chapter 11 to get more or less a recovery of their debts and to get a stronger financial position. So I do not see why today they should use arguments against Middle East carriers that they are partly supported by their national governments.
So is it all just fear of competition then? These Middle Eastern airlines have grown. They've grown very, very fast, and they're a big threat.
I think it is absolutely their fear, and this is a panic attack by trying to get things sorted out in their favor. For the customer, at the end of the day, the question is, do they have the right choice? Do they have the choice between the best airlines? And I think, and I'm coming from an area where there has always been full competition, I think that full competition is at the end of the day in the interest of the consumer.
Yeah, you've worked for Air Berlin and Air France KLM, if I'm not mistaken. What was the environment like in Europe? You know, they weren't terribly welcoming towards the Gulf carriers themselves, with the exception, perhaps we could say, of British Airways, which did welcome Qatar Airways, it was, into the One World Alliance eventually. But Europe and European airlines have had their issues with the Gulf carriers too, haven't they?
Well, I think this is also a little bit a proof of hypocrisy, because in the past, all the European airlines were heavily state-supported. And it is more or less a type of lifespan airlines are going through. If you're setting up an airline and if you're creating the infrastructure, like we are doing in the Sultanate of Oman, it is an investment of the government in the national airline to create the infrastructure and then let it go. And in Europe, the French government, the German government, and even British Airways, they got more state support than 3 or 4 other European airlines together when Margaret Thatcher decided to privatize British Airways. So now in the Gulf, airlines are developing themselves, creating the infrastructure for the country, and of course also the moment will arise here that the state support will be reduced. The Omani government is investing in Oman Air, But at the same time, Oman Air is returning more than $1 billion on a yearly basis to the economy of Oman. And that is the investments like in roads, like in ports, like in railways, like in the airline, as was done in the 60s, in the 70s, and even in the late 80s by the governments in Europe as well.
Okay, so let's talk more about Oman Air. Tell me more about how you fit in the picture, because as I said before, you're obviously not one of these big three Middle Eastern players, but you're operating in the same area, you're servicing the Middle East and North Africa and areas beyond that. How do you compete when it's dominated by those airlines?
Oman has always been a niche, a very special place, and Oman Air is reflecting this in the role it takes as an airline. We are sometimes, as I mentioned, flying under the radar, meaning that at the end of the day, we are knowing exactly where we want to go, but we do not want to compete and get the same scale like the larger Middle East carriers are having. We have an obligation to support to the Sultanate of Oman to bring tourists, but also logistic activities to the Sultanate, like we recently did by signing a joint venture with cargo supplier Cargolux, where we are now bringing full freighters to Oman and creating additional economic activity.
Right, and if you're talking expansion, I mean, you've outlined the effect on the whole of Oman there, but I'm wondering about, well, just the airline itself. Where do you anticipate Oman Air will be in, expanding in 10 or 20 years, say?
We have a very clear roadmap. As I said, we know where we want to go to. And in that roadmap, it is exactly described that we will, by 2020, have 70 aircraft, 25 wide-body, 45 narrow-body. Including that roadmap, there is a clear definition which destinations we are going to fly and to add to our existing network. Like last year, we moved to Manila, we moved to Jakarta. This year we opened Singapore and Goa, and in the coming months we will open Dhaka, Shanghai, and also increase our network to Iraq and possibly, when the sanctions are lifted, to Iran. And for next year we are aiming at Korea, and therefore every season we are ticking off the list by adding the frequencies the moment we get the new aircraft in.
That is Paul Gregorowitsch from Oman Air. We thank you very much for joining us on Counting the Cost this week.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
And we're going to be returning to this story on Counting the Cost. The CEOs of both Emirates and Qatar Airways will be heading to the United States to address the argument head on. We'll bring you their comments and the reaction to it in the next few weeks. But for now, there is still plenty more ahead for you on this edition of Counting the Cost. We'll go to Pakistan, where Chinese investment is making a $1 billion difference. That's still to come on the program. Right now, though, we turn to Brazil, where the national oil company Petrobras has been mired in a decade-long corruption scandal. Finally, it's put a price on the whole affair, $2.1 billion, actually. It was known as the car wash scandal, and it damaged the popularity of Brazil's president, who was Petrobras' former chair, though there's no suggestion of any wrongdoing by Dilma Rousseff herself. Alan Fisher has this report now on how the fortunes of one company affected an entire economy.
This man wants to work, but he's been told every vacancy now has 500 people chasing it. Tiago Abreu was one of those building the new petrochemical plant for the state oil company Petrobras at Itoboraí, about an hour's drive from Rio de Janeiro. But with payments from Petrobras frozen as investigators consider bribery allegations, the company building the plant can't pay wages. Thousands have been sacked.
I have a child, school and nursery to pay, bills to pay. We try to survive. I work when work is available. Even in this construction area, it's been hard.
Marcus Harting is the vice president of the Construction Workers Union. He has a pile of papers from people looking for unemployment benefit from the government. His days are now spent counselling workers, giving advice.
At the end of last year, there were 15,000 or 16,000 workers at competitors. Now there are about 4,500 workers.
Petrobras is one of Brazil's biggest companies. It's alleged senior officials took almost $700 million in bribes when awarding construction contracts. Many that may have taken bribes are linked to the government. The investigation is called Operation Car Wash. One economist says while it's causing pain, Brazil has to do this.
All state enterprises should change their rules in order to follow a much higher standard of governance. Also, the private sector has to be much more transparent, especially in its relations with the government.
It's estimated that 35,000 construction jobs have been lost in the first 2 months of this year, and there's no sign things are going to get better.
Every single man here had a job until just a few weeks ago. Now they're unemployed because of the Petrobras scandal. They've all handed their details into the company behind the white fence because they've heard that it's hiring. And they'll wait here all day because they believe if there is a job, they have a better chance of landing it if they're here than if they just hand in their details and walk away.
Unfortunately, I've been here since 7 in the morning and I haven't gotten anything so far. All this crowd here is in the same situation. We are trying to get our jobs back.
The Petrobras scandal will hit the entire Brazilian economy this year. The investigation continues, and so does the pain of unemployment for thousands who thought their jobs were safe.
And now Pakistan, which needs a bit of help. Its economy is hamstrung by the failure of successive governments to really get to grips with the lack of infrastructure. And with a population fast approaching 200 million, Pakistan's economy is losing up to 6% of GDP just because of a lack of power and infrastructure bottlenecks. So, step forward, Beijing, with its $46 billion One Belt, One Road project to connect inner China with the Middle East and Europe. $33 billion worth of energy projects and coal-fired electricity plants, on almost $10 billion on road and rail projects. By contrast, the United States has spent $31 billion in Pakistan since 2002, with 2/3 going on security spending. Now, China itself will do well out of this. Money will flow through Chinese banks into Chinese companies. They'll employ Chinese workers, just what China needs to stimulate growth. But obviously, Pakistan is a big winner too. Nicole Johnston has this from Islamabad.
High in the Karakoram Mountains, close to the border of China and Pakistan, China is expanding the world's highest international paved road, the Karakoram Highway, and expanding its influence. This is part of a $43 billion project called the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. It will stretch from Kashgar in China's Xinjiang province all the way south through Pakistan to the port city of Gwadar.
When the China-Pakistan corridor becomes operational, China would be directly connected to the Middle East or the Gulf states and to Africa. And this would be a big dividend accruing directly from the corridor.
Construction has started on a Chinese-funded deep-sea port in Gwadar. It will cut the time it takes for goods and oil to reach China from the Middle East from 12 days to 36 hours. And there are all sorts of deals linked to it: coal, solar and wind power, oil and gas pipelines, highways and railways.
This is one of the most impressive buildings in Islamabad, a $30 million convention centre paid for by China. The two countries have a long-tested relationship, one that's based on cultural, economic and strong military ties.
China is Pakistan's biggest supplier of weapons. It helped develop its latest jet fighter, the JF-17 Thunder.
Pakistan is a country that has been plagued by problems from all around. Unless we rise on our own feet, we really cannot depend on others. China has been far more trustworthy, is a much more reliable friend of Pakistan, and I think that is known universally.
The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor revives the old Silk Road traders used centuries ago. A nod to the past, while developing new industries for the future.
Well, Asad Ali's with us now from London to talk about all this. He is an analyst with IHS Global Insight. Nice to have you with us, Asad. I mean, this is just great for Pakistan, isn't it? Not a country which that many people would think about going to invest in, and it gets access to China's billions now.
Yeah, I mean, it's worked out really well for Pakistan and for Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif. He's been looking for foreign investment into Pakistan's energy sector since he came into 2013, but the poor security situation in Pakistan has meant that mainly Western investors and Western countries have not really been prepared to invest in the sector. So this is a very much needed boost for it.
So why China? Is it that just, the idea that it seems to be that China goes to places others don't, particularly the Western countries?
Well, I mean, China's interest in Pakistan is very specific. So China's got this wider, broader Silk Road project going on. Pakistan is one of the big parts of it. Now, specifically, the China-Pakistan economic corridor, which the investment has been made in, is going to give China access to the Arabian Sea and, of course, all of the lucrative oil routes coming out of the Middle East. It's going to shorten transportation times, especially to China's western region.
Tell me about what Pakistan gets out of all this. So obviously they get the infrastructure and the things which will improve their country and their quality of life. But, a lot of the work is going to go to Chinese workers. It's going to go through Chinese banks and Chinese companies. I wonder where the end product comes for your average Pakistani worker.
Well, for Pakistanis will be involved in the project, but if you look at it in terms of the energy crisis in Pakistan, that's the biggest concern for Pakistanis. I mean, Pakistan's got obviously a very it's been problems with militancy are very high on the agenda, but if you ask the average Pakistani, the most pressing concern for them is energy shortages. And if this project can, boost long-term prospects or even short-term prospects for better energy generation, then that's going to be a massive plus for the average Pakistani.
I don't like saying this, but as you describe an economy like that, you start to wonder how it's actually functioned all this time, because so many things seem to be working against it.
Yeah, I mean, Pakistan has shown, some resilience. It grew. The economy itself grew quite a bit under Musharraf's time. So there is hope for it to progress further. But the fundamental of the energy shortage has to be fixed for for Pakistan to reach its real potential.
So Asad, let's go back to the core of this issue, the China-Pakistan relationship. They talk about being all-weather friends. But, you go back to the last time Pakistan needed some money and didn't want to go to the IMF. China didn't exactly have their hand out. I wonder how strong their bond is, or is it just something that suits what China wants to do now and what Pakistan needs now?
Well, I mean, there is obviously a lot of truth in that, but if you look at the foundations of the alliance between China and Pakistan, there is a lot of reason for the relationship to be very strong. When China was isolated, Pakistan acted as a mediator between it and the West. And if you're looking at the investments now, yes, China has its own concerns. China has strong interest in having a very stable Pakistan. China has its own Islamist militancy in its western region, and obviously helping Pakistan will hopefully stop any support that Pakistani militants have in supporting the militants in China. But on the other hand, bringing prosperity to the Western regions is a big part of the Chinese leadership's plans in trying to quell the insurgency there as well.
What about the other relationships Pakistan has?
So China has it all.
Other relationships Pakistan has, for example, the United States. That is a contentious one at best. But the US has pumped about $30 billion into Pakistan. Where did that money go? Was that mostly military spending? Or?
So yeah, that was predominantly military spending. More recently, America has tried to target their aid towards more commercial and civilian government ventures, but predominantly the aid has been towards the military. Now, the difference between what the Americans have done in the past and what the Chinese are doing now is that these investments are very specific. They're being made specifically towards the infrastructure and energy sectors. So this is a very notable different strategy being taken up by the Chinese, which I think is much more prudent in the sense that it bypasses a lot of the leadership, the military leadership, and to some extent the civilian leadership as well that that in the past have been accused of using up the funds for not what they were meant for.
Asad Ali talking Pakistan with us this week on Counting the Cost. Asad, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
And that's our show for this week. But there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. You can also get in touch with us by tweeting either me at KamalAJE. Our business editor is there as well, at Abid Oliver Ali, and you can use the hashtag AJCTC with those tweets, or just drop us an email. Counting the Cost at aljazeera.net is the address. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria. From the whole team, thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.